Hello guys, another little set of audio notes here. This time we're going to be looking at an Irish airman foresees his death. So as before, I'm not recording this as a commentary. It's going to be slightly longer probably than the commentary that you would give on this poem, but I hope by going into more detail you can refresh your memories of some of the features of this poem that you might want to talk about, and also hear how I construct points, hopefully in a useful way. When you're doing this yourself, think about the timing carefully, think how much of all the things you want to say, and you will almost certainly have more than enough to say about each poem. Think of how much of that you can actually get out usefully in 8 minutes. So what you want to do, as I've said before, is you want to make sure that you've covered the main features and you've covered thoroughly the structure of the poem, so you've selected moments to talk about from the whole of the poem and not dwelt too much on one stanza or one part of the poem. But anyway, this is going to be in more detail than you'd be speaking. So having read the poem, I've annotated it, I've refreshed my memory of what the poem is about, I've tried to find a pithy phrase that could explain my thesis statement or my conceptual overview. Hopefully one that you would have prepared previously, and it'll just be a question of remembering it and jotting it down when you see the poem you've chosen. So with this, I'd say An Irish Airman Foresees His Death is, for me, it's a tale of, or an account of, a paradoxical love for an activity that the speaker knows will destroy him, in this case, flying a fighter plane in the First World War. I think that's its broad and universal appeal, is this idea of something that is destructive but fills the speaker with delight and passion. More specifically, as would have been known to, I'd say, a large share of Yeats's audience, it's a poem about the death of Major Robert Gregory, who was one of the few Irishmen to be killed in aerial combat in the First World War. Robert Gregory was the son of Yeats's very good friend Lady Gregory, and the poem appears in the volume The Wild Swans at Cool Park, being the home of the Gregory family, and the volume also featuring a poem in memory of Major Robert Gregory. So the more specific meaning of the poem is to do with the death of this son of his very close friend, but as I will go on to explain, I think it has a more universal appeal. It also asks some more universal questions about the choices people make, both in a time of war and more generally. Some of the features of the poem that I'm interested in are the way it presents ideas of predictability and inevitability and fate, the way it presents a voice that is full of measure and reason. And this very much comes through in the way that syntax and structural and formal features are used. So the way that rhyme and rhythm is used in the poem is very important in establishing that sense of measure and reason. And as I've said, this idea of the responsibility to oneself or to others, and it's set in a time of war, so there's an expectation almost that this will be a war poem that deals with a sense of duty or a rejection of duty. But actually the poem seems to take a more almost existentialist view that the ultimate responsibility is to oneself to pursue the activities that one finds fulfilling and to reconcile oneself to the possible, and in this case it would seem inevitable, end that will lead to. So you start with the title, which is always a good place to start. The title is what in popular culture one might call a spoiler. An Irish Airman Foresees His Death. We know from the start that this speaker will die. There's the sense of fate there, the sense of predictability, which will be reinforced throughout the poem, as it is in the first line. I know that I shall meet my fate. I know that I shall meet my fate. Death is certain. We know it's death from the title, and we know that's his fate from the first line that immediately follows. I know that I shall meet my fate somewhere in the clouds above. There's a sense there when the speaker talks about the clouds above, almost of him looking up. I certainly visualise someone looking at the clouds, so it seems that we meet him before his death, looking to the heavens. The hint's already of that desire to fly. He goes on to say, "Those that I fight I do not hate, those that I guard I do not love." I think what's striking here is the syntax. Quite early in the poem, the speaker is using a very measured tone, and Yeats creates this in a very repetitive way of structuring the lines. So the same construction at the start and the end of each sentence of those two lines. Those that I fight, those that I guard are the two beginnings, and I do not hate, I do not love are the endings. We have this paradox of love and hate, fighting and guarding. And syntactically that could be seen as an example of both anaphora, which is the repetition of a word or phrase at the beginning of a clause, so those that I, and at the same time epistrophe, which is the opposite, which is the repetition of a word or phrase at the end of a clause or sentence. So I do not comes at the end. We have that sense of balance between the two repeated constructions. That sense of almost a rocking feeling that we go from one to the other continues throughout the poem. This sense of measure, like a ticking clock, almost a metronome beating out a regular rhythm, or a ticking clock counting down perhaps to the inevitability of the speaker's death, him meeting his fate. This is reinforced as well within the structure, just to get an idea of how clearly and deliberately this poem is constructed, of a very strong caesura, the break in the middle of the line. Those that I fight, there's a natural pause, I do not hate. Those that I guard, there's a natural pause, I do not love. And the poem in various places has that sense of a strong caesura that divides the four-footed line, the tetrameter, neatly in two. We see it again later in the poem when he says, I balanced all, brought all to mind. I balanced all, brought all to mind. Again, we have the caesura falling neatly in the middle of the line to balance the two halves of the line, the 2 feet on either side. But back to lines 3 and 4. I'm interested in there as well, the inversion of the syntax. So the object comes before the subject. Those that I fight, I do not hate. Instead of saying, I do not hate those that I fight, he says, those that I fight, I do not hate. So he inverts that, the logic of the sentence structure. And I think that might have something to do with the sense that the idea that the speaker is disrupting our expectations. That logic is sort of switched around in this poem in various ways, in unexpected ways. And I think the syntax of those phrases establishes that quite early on here. That brings us to the end of the first quatrain, and the poem is structured in 4 quatrains. Again, the sense of evenness, of balance, of predictability comes through very clearly in the fact that we have 4 quite clearly rhymed quatrains. In the first we have fate above, hate, love, then cross, poor, lost before. Untypically for Yeats, actually, we have a real sense of completion in the rhyme scheme, where he's more likely usually to use half rhymes to express doubts or philosophical questions. In this poem there's a real sense of certainty. We have 4 lines in each quatrain, then we have 4 feet in each line. We have 4 quatrains across that give us the structure of the poem, and each of those quatrains ending with either a full stop or a semicolon. In fact, the full stop lands in the middle of the poem, so it's you could also read it as 2 octets that are separated. 2 octets that are combined into one single stanza. So in the second quatrain, having looked in the first quatrain about at the position he's in terms of the fighting that he's doing or will be doing in the war, the paradox that he neither loves the people that he is protecting, nor does he hate the people that he is going to battle against. He perhaps give some hint as to why, that his country is Kiltartan Cross, suggests that the people he's fighting for are not the people of his country, and the people that is fighting against are not his enemy, and the people he's guarding are not the people of his country. This could be a link to Ireland's status in the First World War, that the war was being fought on behalf of England, and maybe this is a reference to Irish nationalism, that although Yeats is Anglo-Irish, he is... there's always a question of his sympathy otherwise towards the nationalist struggle. Certainly it's not a simple case of him rejecting the English, but there's an implication here that perhaps the speaker considers Kiltartan to be separate from those questions of nationalism or colonialism. It's a hint. It's something that's suggestive, that it's not spelt out. Either way, it's very clear that the speaker's community, the speaker's country, is Kiltartan, a barony in the west of Ireland, and it's the home of Lady Gregory, the Cool Park. So again, this sense that this is Major Robert Gregory's voice that's being ventriloquised here in the poem. And he says nothing that could happen to him in the war would affect them, that his death or the success or failure of the campaign he's part of will have no effect. That's clearly not the reason that he's going. Having established that those aren't the reasons why he's going, in the third stanza, he goes further to explore possible reasons that he might have gone to fight, and again reject them. So nor law nor duty bade me fight, nor public man nor cheering crowds. So a list of all the kind of things that might be expected to be the impulse for someone to go to war, the public duty. The repetition of nor, again we have this sense of the balance back and forth between the lines, these pairings that pop up throughout the poem. And he arrives at the actual explanation, which is a lonely impulse of delight drove to this tumult in the clouds. And that's interesting for a couple of reasons. The lonely impulse of delight. Lonely seems to contrast delight. Does he mean lonely in the sense of a sentimental or unhappy sensation, or does he mean singular? Does he mean it happened to him and him alone? Or is the sense of melancholy there maybe something that's matched by the sort of the measure and the slow pace of the poem as one reads it? Is there a feeling of loneliness? Is there a feeling of isolation, that he's heading into this certain death on his own, rejecting, again, public men or cheering crowds? Companionship seems to be rejected. An impulse of delight drove to this tumult. So there we have delight contrasted with tumult. Tumult is the only reference in the poem really to the fact of his death, which, presumably dying in an air battle, would be a violent, painful, terrifying death. It's hard to imagine it being any other way, but reading this poem, again with this sense of balance and measure, there's very little sense of the chaos or the horror of war. He goes on in the final quatrain to talk about the reconciliation that he's made with himself, with his fate. And he begins it by saying, I balanced. And this then really is the crux of the poem, that balance is so important in this poem, in the way that it's structured, in the way that he considers reasonably and rationally his reasons for wanting to go to war and wanting to go to what he knows will be his death. I balanced all, brought all to mind. Again, as identified before, we've got that very clear caesura in the middle of the line. The years to come seemed waste of breath, a waste of breath the years behind. So over the break of those lines in the middle of the stanza, a waste of breath, using a form of anadiplosis, where the words that end one phrase then begin the next phrase. So, similar to the anaphora and the epistrophe earlier in the poem, he's using syntax very much to create this sort of sense of a ticking clock or a metronomic rocking back and forth of this beat of time that goes through the poem. And And indeed, as is very clever in this structure, we start with balance, we end with balance. So there's the sense that the first and the last line of the poem, of the stanza, balance each other as well. Balanced all in balance with. Throughout the poem, we have this sense of regularity, this sense of predictability. In balance with this life, this death. And then at the end here, this is, I find it quite interesting, the caesura there, that whereas the caesura, when there has been a very emphatic caesura, has tended to be very much in the middle between the first and second, and then the third and fourth feet of the line. Here we have 3 feet of the line in balance with this life, and then isolated after that, very strong comma, this death. And the sense of finality within that is very, very powerful. The conclusion of those 2 words, this death, impossible to read any other way than as a now in this way is where I'm going to embarrass myself by not remembering whether it's a spondy or not. And then we have the 2 heavily stressed syllables. I'm going to say it is, and if you say so too, then hopefully the examiner will just listen and say, yeah, fine, that'll do. So I've worked through that in again in a relatively chronological way. I then, if I had time, might go on to speak about the questions that it throws up about whether this is a satisfying view or whether it's a complicated view of a soldier dying in wartime. Is it about heroism? Does it feel like it's something to be celebrated or something to be lamented? Although it's a poem that works with a strong, determined sense of measure and reason and clarity of thought, and we see that clarity in the very simple, clear rhythms and clear rhythms and the rhyme scheme and the solidity of the structure. Is it, though, a poem that seems to sidestep some very big issues of why young men generally die in war and leave their families grieving? Is it an easy route out to present it as all being a single impulse or a singular impulse of one person who decides that they love flying so much that they're prepared to risk their life in order to be able to do it? I think that's it wouldn't be a Yeats poem if there wasn't some deep ambiguity in there somewhere, and I think that really might be it. Is how is the reader left feeling about this death and the activity that led to it? How are we to feel about the choice that the Irish Airman has made? Are we to accept it and almost celebrate it, or is it something that should feel unjust and regrettable? Again, in classic form, Yeats doesn't really give us a conclusion. Okay, so a poem I think where there's a lot of mileage to be had in the form of the poem. We could have talked more about the sound patterning in it. Could have talked more about the political implications, although I became a little unstuck. I don't know if you noticed when I was talking about the issues of the war being fought for Britain by Ireland, and that's really because there's a level of historical detail there that I don't feel is particularly helpful to get into, but you might want to. You might want to do some research about the Gregory family's relationship with the British Army and why Robert Gregory was fighting there. I would probably skate over that a little bit and simply identify that the speaker sees himself removed from the battle, so he's not either on the side of the people doing the fighting, nor is he against the people being fought. I think that's the most useful thing to look at there. Splendid. Any questions, any thoughts, any comments, any differences of opinion on this poem, please do let me know. Thanks, guys.